We were already questioning our own elders in our families. I mean, like I had so much of trouble with my father. Why was I going to put up with a patriarch in the Communist Party? I mean, the last thing I would do would be to tolerate a patriarch there. I wrote the book. It was difficult writing. I wept every time I wrote. In a sense, I don't know still why it's so difficult to come to terms with that first episode, because I was like so helpless. You were strapped down, you were sedated, and then you don't know what happened to you. And then you saw other people coming out of the room, eyeballs popping out and drooling. And then you were like so totally out that whole day. There was nothing you could do the whole day. And the worst part of it is not knowing, there's no sense of self, because you forget things, you forget who you are, what you are, and you're like so totally helpless in this sense. You're just like a thing being taken there, taken out. So, in that sense, it was. I can't imagine myself being like that, so powerless, So it's who who am I kind of thing? Am I that powerless creature, or am I who I think is confident and willing to take on so many things? And then I don't know if I'm feeling bad for the young woman there. I was barely 21. So it's still not resolved in my head.
Hi, I'm Shoma Chaudhury. Thanks for watching Enquiry. I have a unique guest on the show today whose extraordinary personal life epitomizes many of the big issues and fault lines in our country. Gita Ramaswamy was a privileged Brahmin girl who joined the Naxal movement in college, and she went underground during the emergency. Later, disillusioned with the movement, she moved away and worked in the Ghaziabad slums for many years, and then still later went to Ibrahimpatnam in Telangana, where she worked with the landless bonded labor, Madigas, for almost 10 years, fighting issues of justice and transforming thousands of lives. Now, Gita has written a thought-provoking and riveting memoir called Land, Guns, Caste, Woman, which is a searing and honest account about her life's journey, the role of violence in society, and the politics of change. Gita has fought hypocrisy, humbug, and the patriarchy fiercely at every step of her life. And she's paid a very high price for it, including having her family electrocute her brain for 20 days, trying to reorient her thinking and rescuing her from marrying a Naxal. We'll be speaking to her about all of this. Gita, you've lived an eventful and extraordinary life, and it's a privilege to have you on my show. Thank you so much for joining me on Enquiry.
Thank you, Shoma.
So, Gita, for the audience that's not familiar yet with your book and your life, I just wanted to say in a nutshell that you were born into you were born as a Brahmin into a life that could have led you to a life of privilege, normalcy, convention. Instead, you eschewed that, you went underground, you became a Naxal for a while, you eschewed that, then you worked with the Ghaziabad poor, then you started the Hyderabad Book Trust, then you worked for many, many years with Ibrahimpatnam, the bonded labor in Telangana. And then at a sudden catalytic moment, you left all of this life of revolutionary politics, desire for change, and somewhat came back to a life of convention. So that's a huge arc with many, many strands, which we're going to explore. But I wanted to start with just this catalytic moment, that you could have lived a life of convention as a Brahmin girl, married, taken up a job, very intelligent. What drew you into this extraordinary and difficult life that you've led? Do you remember can you put it down to any milestone?
Yes, yes. One is a convent school education. I don't mean a convent school English education, basically, where you're introduced to modern science textbooks. Another is, we were 5 daughters, and 5 daughters at that time, dowry, getting them married was like, big millstone on my parents' neck. And I was dark skinned. So, my mother would say, like, who's going to marry you? Who's going to marry you? So I decided that this, marriage was not for me, and I'm going to work hard, study hard, and do something with my life. I'm not going to be a wife to anybody. And because of being introduced to science in school, and the tension between the science in school and the orthodoxies at home, the rituals at home, which tell you that menstruation is impure, polluting, and that you can't touch the idols, you can't do this, you can't do that. So that kind of tension was because I'd already decided I was not going to be the stereotype Brahmin woman, because I was dark skinned, and that was making my mother so unhappy. So I got something to do with my life. And the final thing was when a sister whom I adored very much had she was beaten by her husband for not giving him her earnings. And that broke my heart. I mean, I thought somebody who's like so smart, so good looking, talented, and holding a good professional job, if she can be beaten by a husband, my God, what's there in life? What's there in that kind of life? So that was like the absolute turning point of my life. I
Right.
said, I'm just going to do what I want to do. Nobody's going to tell me what to do.
So one is this, that introduction to science made you question all the conventions and the orthodoxies of your life.
Yes.
So you were in college, and then to move from that into a life of Naxalism, which is a belief in radical revolution, armed revolution, violence as a tool, legitimate tool of change. Were there any, of course, I've read the book, but I'm trying to mediate that for the audience, that who were the, charismatic figures, or again, was it a broad structure of the country that you were seeing, or were there charismatic figures that drew you, as a student into this life?
Yeah, there were both the context as well as the charismatic figure. But apart from that, my own life, in the sense, I had got a seat in IIT, and my father said he can't afford this for a daughter. And so that completed the circle that, this life was not going to be for me. I was like embittered, I was resentful. So when I came into campus, and this was in 71, and 71 was just after Naxal, after Vietnam. Che Guevara was a big, legend. And there was a the feminist movement there, Black Panthers. There were so many things that one read about, heard about. And I think that was the time, I mean, I think all young people are looking for change, are looking for new things. So these were the new things in my life at that time. And there was a whole new group of people on campus who were discussing this. It was George Reddy who sort of sparked off this mini revolution on campus. I later married his brother. I mean, that's apart. But so when he was killed, when he was alive, he was, yes, a charismatic figure. But when he was killed, then, the charisma sort of quadrupled, and a whole group was formed, and people said, if he died, so will we, let's make a revolution and die. Those were the heroics of that time. And so we were a bunch of students sort of waiting eagerly to fall into a Naxalite party's lap, so to say. I mean, we were already committed, dedicated, wanting to do something. And there were enough groups in Andhra Pradesh who wanted to rope us in, and we got roped in and were part of the movement. Yes.
So now when you look back, and you do in your book, which is a very, very powerful and, I mean, searingly honest, Gita, really a salute to writing, because there is no point in writing if one is not giving a completely honest eye to, and very deep and difficult conversations and themes in your life. So one is first the kind of idealistic belief in revolution. And then you have a great repudiation of what the entire spectrum of, Naxal parties stood for, whether the CPIML or the PWG, and there's a great repudiation of that politics as well. So first, I want to stick with what enamored you, while you were there, what was enlivening, or, what made it feel worthwhile, because it involved immense sacrifice. You had to live in very penurious circumstances. You had to live on the run. But what made it seem worthwhile at that point?
Oh, because we were treated with respect. Remember, this was the early 70s. And I mean, I was already feminist by that time and, like out, very in your face feminist. And here was this party, here was this group which treated your idea with not just yourself with respect, your ideas with respect. And while everybody else was making fun of you, thinking you're some kind of nutcase. And so that was the single factor that if they treated women like this with respect, oh, this is worth going into. So I was not really like into the poor so much at that time. It was more of how women were being mistreated and what feminism means. And so when this group, gave out this kind of attitude, it's a natural sort of progression into discovering further marginalities. And then when you find that the marginalities actually are seamless, it's possible to do both. Well, that's really ideal, isn't it? And so, oh, when you're young, you're never bothered about whether you have a next meal or whether you have a bed to sleep on. You can stay 3 days up without sleep. You can walk like miles. So those things really don't worry you when you're young. I mean, I don't think they worry anybody if you have something which you're passionate about.
Yeah, but right through the book, and I will keep coming back to the personal level. I want your thoughts on some of the big, changes that happened in your life, because they're pertinent for the whole country. But when you're talking of this, just the deprivation of idealism, especially if you're coming from upper caste and you're driven by idealism, it's not an accident of your birth that you are fighting for change.
Yes.
Then it's you have an ironic eye right through about even the physical discomforts that it entailed. So before we move into the bigger topics, can you talk about that? What did this life entail? Like, how difficult was it really to do that? You're airbrushing it now as it not mattering, but in your book you do speak of how difficult it was to live in one room, no light, no food.
Yeah, but the Ibrahimpatnam years were more difficult because I was like cross 30 at that time. The initial years when I was just 22 was not so difficult because there were other people like me who had come from equally privileged backgrounds who were also like, living it out in the tough. And so, it's like being without food, and then suddenly you meet someone who's, we go to someone's house who's a friend, and then you sort of finish everything in her larder, like you just clean up the whole house. Somebody has a milkmaid dabba, the milkmaid dabba goes. So it's like, binge eating when you have some food and then not eating. And the difficulties in that, is, well, your chappals break, you don't have money to buy a new chappal, you don't have money for buy bus fare, so you walk it, right? And so then the small things in life, like I remember how I prized chikki. In those days, a chikki costed 5 paisa or 10 paisa or something like that. Just one 5 paisa of chikki would like sort of fill your heart.
Right. So, let's just look at this first part of your life, which is that, you became a party member, you were part of the Naxals. During the emergency, you went underground. I'll come back to the experiential end of it, but just looking back at it, what do you think the whole armed struggle movements achieved? And then what was the source of your disillusion? And I'll come to your sort of dilemmas over violence as a tool of change later, but just the overall party ideology. What do you think armed struggle even achieved? And then why did you personally come to repudiate it and leave it?
Yeah, that's a tough question because many of my friends are still in it. So in a sense, when I say that armed struggle was not a way for India and is not a way for India, it's going to be very disappointing to some people. But I do think what we did then, I mean, I don't regret it at all. I don't regret it one bit because it gave me my steel. It sort of really tempered me. But it was not, armed struggle didn't achieve anything except for, you lost so many valuable lives. So many talented young people were just shot dead or killed by malaria, dysentery. And so many poor people got caught in the crossfire between police and the Naxals that, oh my, that it doesn't justify even one life that was lost there. So I mean, I think that what we did then was like some bravado, act of bravado, and which young people do, and then you think over it, mature, and where is it leading you? Because our goal was to work with the poor people, transform their lives, help their lives change, come out of poverty, destitution, get educated, get good health services. And none of this was being, talked about in the party. The party wanted power. The parties look for, grasping the state by its coattails and, taking it over, and not about changing the lives of the poor. And when you, we are idealistic in the sense that you see a poor beggar, you see a maid who's struggling at 5 o'clock in the morning with a child wailing behind her to come to work. That's poverty for you. You want to, help change the lives of these people, not some abstract state somewhere. And even that was like, a glorious failure. I mean, taking the state head on was like a total failure. So by all counts, I think armed struggle was like, it was a failed movement, failed experiment.
So one is that even in its intention, which was change and radical change and, inspired by Mao. I actually want to come back and ask you about why Mao was so inspirational, because now we know how much violence he was wreaking on his own country and own countrymen. But even assuming this was the intent, you're saying first it failed its intent, which was to transform the lives of the poor. But it's very interesting. And as I said, it's searingly honest that you also speak of the extreme corrosion and corruption and actually delusions, within the movement itself. And, would you talk about that? Because, and you actually then moved to a very different path of creating change. And I'd like to contrast those two. But first, in addition to knowing that you weren't delivering on what your idealistic intent was, there was also a horrific sense of the corruption within. So can you talk about that?
Yeah, I think that those who are, for a long time in the party, look for a change in political power. Those like me who come in fresh, we want to bring about a change in society. This taking over political power is a very abstract concept. Doesn't make sense to us. So the tension comes from there, that we are looking for doables. They are looking for how far can we get, this stretch of territory liberated, or how many more cadre, how many more arms, etc., which don't make sense for people like me. So, and this is never clearly articulated, in the sense that I think they let you get along with your idealistic concepts, hoping that somewhere, you will also sort of fit in and learn that, look, this is not the way it's going to be done. But they reckon without two things. One is, we were not the children of communists. Usually it's the children of communists and, whoever followed the dynasty. We were an entirely new breed, from educated, felt that we had, given up something in the earlier world and come here, so we must do something. And we were already questioning our own elders in our families. I mean, like, I had so much of trouble with my father. Why was I going to put up with a patriarch in the Communist Party? I mean, the last thing I would do would be to tolerate a patriarch there. They reckoned without that. They thought that this, it's not, it's doable. And then the emergency came and really sort of messed up things. Because usually in a party hierarchy, you have very clear hierarchies, protocols, whom you meet, whom you don't meet. So you're not likely to hear stories which you shouldn't hear of. Yeah, there are many secrets kept. So when emergency came, all our places were raided. People had to run helter-skelter. I left twice for Delhi because I was out on the streets in Hyderabad. I had to just take a train and, go to Delhi where somebody would give me shelter. And so when you met people outside the hierarchy, you heard all kinds of stories. And we heard, for example, that the forest was a liberated area. There was squads, the forest was a liberated area. It was their government which was running. And meanwhile, in the forest, they had heard that campus was like full of these brilliant young students who controlled the campus now. And here we were sort of, don't know when the next minute who's going to be shot, captured, and no dens, no money. And so it was a time of great disillusionment that something like this could happen. And then when I confronted the party leader with this, because he and his partner came to stay with us, and those 3 months were like real eye openers. Because of the way they lived. I mean, well, they belonged to an older generation, and he certainly had feudal values. She would run his bath. She would sort of, rub him down with soap, towel him up. She would put his plate with all the food there. She would take the plate afterwards and clean it. She would cook, and she would buy clothes, something, we never did. I mean, we always had hand-me-downs. And then chicken, we ate only beef, because beef was the food of the poor people. And she'd like cook chicken. So I started questioning. I said, why chicken? Why beef? Why are you putting his bath? And my initial quarrels were with her, with asking her why this, why. And she looked at me that come from Mars, because, that's the environment she grew up in. I mean, I'm not sort of blaming her now, but the tension between us was so much that she said, I don't know, you ask him. Then when I asked him, and I said, how does this justify it in a communist party? We are fighting for socialism. And then he threw this book across the room and said, you and I can read. Can they read? They can't read. We are different people. We are leaders. They are the people. And I thought, my God, that's like, plunging a sword into my heart, because once you say we are different and they are different, that's assuming such a dimension of inequality that no fight is worth it. No fight is worth when you're not fighting for what, you believe is inherent to
your caste.
yourself. So that's when, once we questioned, and then we were like expelled, thrown out. And it was not just me, there were other people, though, I was a ringleader of sorts, in the sense we prepared documents, writing all this down, arguing this down, and we stayed for 2-3 months trying to argue this. Other people had similar opinions, but they quietly sort of went back to their families. And so that's when we quit, because there's no way to stay in Hyderabad. I mean, the party could, between the party and the police, which was like a tough place. So that's when we left for Delhi and Ghaziabad.
So I'll come to those chapters of, in fact, why you continued that journey of change, because after this horrible disruption, rupture in your psyche, loss of idealism, again, you could have gone back to a conventional life or sought, like you said, many people went back to their mainstream lives, took jobs, but you continued on a lifelong journey of change. But before that, I just wanted to, talk a little more about Naxalism, because, right up till, barely 4 or 5 years ago, Prime Minister Manmohan Singh had said it's the biggest internal security threat to the country. But there was a very lively debate about what role the Naxals were playing. Were they raising the issues of the poor? Were they at least invoking what is constitutionally due to the lower classes and the working classes? So, but when you actually are analyzing and you're voicing your doubts, in your book, you say that actually they were not even leading programs that were people driven. It was very much just about expansion of the party. So rather than me mouthing it, can you talk about the deeper disillusions and hypocrisies that you uncovered there, and when you contrast that later with the tools of change you engaged with?
Yeah, I do want to say at the outset that many of them come with a vision of change, fighting inequality, many of them, yes. I've never met finer people in my life. Let me say that I've met like a whole lot of people, never met finer people than those I've met in the ML. And there are many issues they do take up. It's not as if it's all party and power. There are many issues they've taken up, at least in the Andhra area, I'm familiar. They broke tea glasses and broke the back of untouchability in the Telangana villages. They made the Doras run for their lives in the Telangana villages. And they gave the poor a sense of self-respect and dignity, which was not there earlier. And this was in a wide area. So they brought tremendous change in Telangana. And I'm sure wherever else they're working in Bastar and Chhattisgarh. But these are really spin-offs in a sense that they're not woven into their daily ideology. I mean, ideology is not like something written in a party manifesto. It's like in your lived life, it has to be woven into every strand of your lived life. So I think it's not woven into the strand of the lived life, which is why there are so many dichotomies in the sense, for example, they raise money from BD contractors. They take money from criminals. Okay, they take money from drug peddlers, and they charge money, and the weight of that donation eventually falls back on the state and on poor people who pay the taxes. So if your BD contractor is going to pay you, like 10 crores, he's going to chop off 1 rupee per, kilo of leaves that he pays to the poor. And if you're taking money from a drug peddler who's got a whole kind of horrendous contacts, how are these justified? And the lack of transparency which is there in an organization of this kind, they always say that this is due because we are attacked by the state, so we need to be careful about security, etc. This lack of transparency is what actually defeats them, because one among them can be totally dishonest, pocketing the money and then running off after 2 years, and nobody would have a clue. And one incident like this, which is not dissected, not analyzed carefully, and not and the question is not asked, why are we failing again and again? So which then leads me to think that the aim of fighting inequality and bringing about a just society is not as important as the existence of that party itself. Somehow there are very good people coming into it. There are enormous struggles which have taken place. But when these kinds of deceptions, hypocrisy are there, you're unable to face it, you're unable to discuss it. And so finally, when it comes to it, it is not woven into your ideology at all. So which means there is a heavy burnout rate in their men.
That brings me to the next question, which is that right till the end of the book, though you lived then I know you're not going to like the word, but it is a heroic life of sacrifice and change, but through more peaceful means, more difficult. But you're still ambivalent about the place of violence as a tool of change. Why is that? What is your thoughts about violence?
Yeah, because when you read history, you read about, say, the suffragettes in Britain. They chained themselves to the footpath railings. They broke glasses. They attacked people, right? And those were the means by which they got the vote for women. So when it's like, in some situations, can you say that it is possible to do it without violence? I'm not sure. Mao was also like, you had mentioned earlier that he was an inspiration. He was an inspiration despite whatever has happened in China afterwards. What he wrote about the Hunan movement, how you respect people, how you work among them, what kind of issues you take up. I've never seen a better exposition of movement work. I still have to see a better exposition of movement work. Maybe to some extent, Marcos in Central America has been, a figure, has been a writer who's writing about that. But without, when you go totally constitutionally and you're backed up in a corner, what else do you do sometimes? How is it possible to change a state which has its tentacles in every sphere without some violence? I'm not able to answer that question, which is why I continue to be ambivalent. Wherever violence seems like so unnecessary, as in the Naxal movement, it's an open and shut area. But in some other areas, it might not be. Suffragettes especially was what I was like enchanted when I read about how they use violence to fight for. And this is in Britain in the early 20th century, late 19th century. They use violence. The women who are like totally unschooled by any of these ideologies. Also anarchists in the United States.
Yeah.
But by and large, violence doesn't pay. Is like, I accept that by and large.
Yeah. I'll dwell a little bit more on this before we come to your own life being an example of how one did not need violence actually to create tremendous change in psyche as well as social condition. But I just want to dwell on this a little bit more because, you also say that there's a great scorn for, say, the Gandhian way of doing things. It's seen as charity. But if you look, and I mean, I'm also trying to work this through with you, because in fact, during the Tehelka years, when I think we had interviewed a Naxal leader, and I had asked him that, when you're fighting for correct issues and you use violence, it completely distorts the issue, because the state has every right then to respond to you with violence. So why do you use violence, and why do you believe it to be core to the ideology? And he had said, because you need a theater of protest. He said, if you protest peacefully, then people don't give you attention, but if you kidnap a district collector, or but I mean, killing, like you said, you have to draw the line, that doesn't work. But some tools of theatrical attention, is sometimes needed. And so I think that drawing the line, because like you said, if the Bhopal gas victims have walked for many years, coming peacefully to Jantar Mantar, asking for their constitutional right, and they haven't been given attention, so I think when you are expressing your ambivalence, it's about how creatively can you get attention without veering over into becoming that which you detest, which is just killing and bombing and violence, and you're just increasing the cycle of conflict there. So
nicely put, very nicely put.
Because I'm not an advocate of violence at all, but I understand that I'm sitting in a privileged place. What about farmers or Dalits who want attention and are not getting attention? How do you create a theater of protest? I think is a very, very important question. But I'm still going to ask you one more personal question on violence, that you yourself once carried a trunk of guns and money without even knowing it. So what was your emotion when you realized you'd been used like that? And secondly, there's a very conscious moment of violence that you speak of, when one of your comrades wanted to surrender, and that may have compromised all of you. And you personally suggested that he be killed,
Yes.
Can you talk about your mindset there? Would you say you were brainwashed? Were you conscious of what you were saying? And how did you reconcile with that later?
It was irresponsible. I was conscious, certainly. I was irresponsible because, there's a high, you're in a team. There are going to be people. I'm not going to actually pull the trigger. I've never handled a gun in my life. But there's somebody who will do it. All you have to say, do it, or something like that. So it's irresponsible. More than anything else, it was like totally irresponsible. Carrying the guns to Banaras, I thought, my God, that was like too much. How did they do that? I could have, because I didn't know the place. It took hours to get there. And any moment, that heavy trunk, somebody had opened it, I would have been really done for. So that was, but it was still a high in the sense, okay, I carried it off. I could carry it off. But this wanting to kill the comrade, luckily whoever were my committee members, all shot it down in a minute. But it haunted me for a very long time. And I met him after 10, 15 years. And the first thing I said was, before we are friends again, let me tell you, this is what I wanted to do to you at one time. He just laughed it off and said, of course I know. And of course you are like emotional and immature. So that's fine, he said. But it was a big burden that I carried for a long time, that I had even wanted to, kill someone, suggest that someone be killed. It was a burden I carried. I've never forgotten that. And even later in the Ibrahimpatnam movement, I would suggest, some landlord beaten up our people so badly. Why don't we beat him back? And it was ideal in the sense, I know nobody would take me up on the suggestion. It was just to see, kina thoda sa ki chabi deke koi leta hai ki nahi. And then I was shot down like every time. So it's like irresponsible, and it's like playing a little bit Joker, I think. I can't imagine myself raising my hand against anyone. It's difficult.
Actually, that in a way that's emphasizing again this almost disconnect. It's different, like you're saying, if it is coming out of an absolute genuine sense of entrapment that someone impoverished may feel, and different from someone coming from outside with an ideology of violence as a tool of change. There's a huge dishonesty in that, Do you now, looking back over your whole life and your second half of your life in Ibrahimpatnam, do you now have a clearer sense that yes, massive change can come without violence, and what are the tools of that?
Oh yes, oh yes. I really think we've not explored what we can do without violence. We've not really explored it because it's the violence is such an easy way out. You do something and somebody gets terrified of you, and because of the terror, they move out, run away, or whatever. But that's not lasting change because once the terror is removed, they come back again. And people are not empowered because when you use violence, people are not the tools of change. It's a gun, it's a machine which is the tool of change. And when you work in constitutional methods, because we do have a wonderful constitution. I mean, I didn't know about the constitution earlier. So it was like, it was like totally staggering. My God, all the things that we want to do are there in the constitution. All we have to do is to fight for those rights. And there are tools by which you can engage with the constitution, the courts, the revenue authorities, even the police. I mean, it's like pushing the space to the maximum. And that requires patience and hard work. You need to like have a prolonged struggle, like Ehsan Jafri's wife is doing. I mean, I think that's a remarkable thing that she's doing, in pushing it and pushing it and pushing it. You need to push till the perpetrators are punished, and then that's a lesson for society that you can't get away with crime.
We'll come back later at the end of the conversation to discuss the nature and structure of violence today. But, in America and elsewhere, even in India, just protest, peaceful protest, strikes, the middle class, people coming from privileged backgrounds have begun to even disenfranchise and distrust the right to protest, to block a road, even to strike. And I think that's a very dangerous trend, because then you're really taking away the voice of people,
Yes.
Before we move away from the Naxals and the fact that they deluded themselves, they deluded young people, they didn't live out their own idealism. I wanted to ask you that, do you feel in the 1780s, right up to actually the 2000s, when even in Chhattisgarh, do you think that, yes, they are misguided, their methodology, and we've spoken of all of that, but do you think that they at least put issues on the table which perhaps would not have got foregrounded? Or do you think, looking back, that anyway those issues were already being constitutionally addressed?
Yes, they raise very important questions. They raise the questions of tribals' rights to the land on which they belong, the right to the forest produce, and that settlers cannot be allowed to come and take over. And even in Chhattisgarh, Bastar, one of the key issues is that the tribals' right, the Adivasis' right to the forest produce, and the fight against taking over all these for minerals, which the central government is handing over to all kinds of agencies. That is also, I think, very important issue. How many, if the Naxals hadn't highlighted those issues, would they have achieved even that prominence that they have? So yes, Naxals have taken up very important issues, without a doubt.
Your book is called Land, Caste, Guns, Woman. And those are really the big themes that the country faces, actually. And all these had differing impacts on men and women. So even when you left the movement, you speak of the tremendous physical, emotional, psychic impact it had on you as a woman. So can you talk about that, the depression, the ill health? And I'll still come to what happened when your family found out that you'd married a Naxal. But first, just this, what did leaving the movement do to you?
It was like losing a family again, all over again. I lost my family earlier. Now I was losing the second family. And you're orphaned. You're virtually orphaned. And it's just not orphaning. The things that you believed in were destroyed before your eyes. And I had wanted to do something. And I think for men, it's different because they don't have to give up as much as we have to, as women have to when they come into a movement. And it's easy for them to slip into some other life, though I've known men also who found it very difficult. But I found uniformly that women found it terrible, because if you return to the family who's going to say, we told you so, and you should never have done it, you hear that all your life. If you don't return to your family, you have no other set of people. And the worst thing is you've lost your dream. What do you live for? So that's terrible. That the destruction of the dream is terrible. I do know women who've had nervous breakdowns. It was almost teetering on the edge of one. So,
yeah. So, Gita, I'm going to ask you, I want to focus on the personal, because here the personal, it actually is symptomatic of all the larger themes we're speaking of. But speak a little bit more about, the fact that all through your life, you've had to really struggle with a lot of physical ill health coming out of this practice of change, depression, you tried committing suicide, and also take us back to that, big rupture in your life where your family, actually put you through electromagnetic, therapy to try and re-brainwash you. So you, in a way, also exemplify what happens to, the working class on the ground, caught between the state and the Naxals. You were caught between the power structure of your family and the Naxals. Both were trying to brainwash you. Do talk about that.
No, there's something which I hid for a long time. No one knew about it. In fact, some of my closest friends are horrified when they read it in the book now. I think except for two people, we were working on a mental health chapter when I mentioned this to the two other co-authors. They're the only people who knew about it till this book was out. Nobody knew about it. It was too painful to talk about because it had a lot of effect on me in the sense that part of my memory was destroyed. And my family is my own. When your own does it to you, who do you, I mean, there's no aggressor, right? These are people who think they're doing good to you by doing this. I mean, I know it, that they were not it was not with malicious intent. They were convinced that I would be, come back to what they call as normalcy, and I would be re-brainwashed if this man had taken it up. So how do you blame them for being in the wrong time in a wrong age kind of thing? So that was very painful. And didn't talk about it for a long time. And when I wrote the book, it was difficult writing. I wept every time I wrote. In a sense, I don't know still why it's so difficult to come to terms with that first episode, because I was like so helpless. You were strapped down, you were sedated, and then you don't know what happened to you. And then you saw other people coming out of the room, eyeballs popping out and drooling. And then you were like so totally out that whole day. There was nothing you could do the whole day. And the worst part of it is not knowing, there's no sense of self. Because you forget things, you forget who you are, what you are. And you're like so totally helpless in this sense. You're just like a thing being taken there. Taken out. So in that sense, it was. I can't imagine myself being like that. So powerless, So it's who am I kind of thing? Am I that powerless creature, or am I who I think is confident and willing to take on so many things? And then I don't know if I'm feeling bad for the young woman there. I was barely 21. So it's still not resolved in my head. And when I was writing this book, I did manage to talk to my sister the first time after so many years. And they said, don't blame us because our mother was sort of so bent on saving you. So if I had a villain at that end, I'd feel so much better. I'd say, oh, this villain needs to be kicked. I'd do this to him, I'd do that. There's no villain to blame either, except for society. And to some part, Chennai. I never went back to Chennai for about 15 years after that. I hated the city because I thought it was the city. It wasn't public. It was on the street where everybody could. And nobody came to save me or help me or say anything except, abuse me. So I thought this whole Chennai is such a Brahmin city and such a foul city. It took me a long time I still dislike Chennai for that matter. Everything seems Brahmin to me about Chennai. It's very funny, not that there must be so many areas which are not there, but it's so dominated that we're colored by this experience.
Absolutely. And like I said, this helplessness you're talking about, you could actually extrapolate that to this loss of self. You actually felt that betrayal from within, from both your families, the Naxal movement and your own closest, which is your parents, your sisters. this complete erosion of self that you're talking about, the helplessness. I think, you know, the fact that you're able to speak of it this honestly, it could resonate and extrapolate with a lot of people and a lot of lives in different settings, you know, because that this complete sense of loss of self is the deepest violence actually that anyone can face. You know? And they did keep you locked in a room. And like you're saying, you kept calling out to people on the street, but it was taken as commonplace. And
totally. In fact, they said you're so lucky they're keeping you alive. We would have shot you dead. As a Naxalite, you should be shot dead. You deserve a fate of death. I mean, which is like so, I mean, how can someone say something? They don't know who you are. They don't know what you're doing. And they want to kill you. I mean, this kind of hatred is, it was hatred on a continuing basis for all the time I was calling out. Then, of course, I learned not to call out. So, which meant there wasn't any one person there who thought, why should a young girl be? So it's so normative for society that you can lock up a young woman or you can torture her, beat her into submission. It's so, even now it's normative, because when you have all these honor killings and then they take the girl back home, imprison her, you would just take it for granted that you can do to women what you want to do.
You know, and why I'm saying that you can resonate with this in other settings is because the same blinding, this normatization that, you know, someone else suffering is all right if they don't fit in with your way of thinking. Today, whether it's, you know, in a different context, you know, we're not thinking what Muslims might be feeling. You know, it's fine if they are suffering because they don't fit in with your way of thinking or your idea of nationalism. And this, in many ways, it's the same spectrum, you know, that you're a Brahmin girl not fitting with societal needs. So your suffering then is inconsequential, you know. I'm moving away now, but I just found it interesting that, you know, this, again, I'm trying to focus on this idea of violence, that you just said that how odd that people could say, we'll shoot you without even knowing who you are, what your circumstances are. But similarly, you know, those who believe in violence as a tool are willing to shoot anyone else, you know. So it's this, that violence ultimately, you know, like we discussed, that a creative theater of protest is one thing, but violence, ultimately, there's a morality, I guess, to killing and not killing, you know. And like you said, it's a very difficult question to answer in black and white. But when violence comes to you, then you're very black and white about you know, what's not okay. So I now, just before we move again to this big chapter, you spoke of this horrific experience in your life, but there was another very important strand with which you paid with your body for wanting to believe in change and be an instrument of change, that you struggled with disease, with chronic, you know, urinary infection. Any woman listening to this will know what that means, how painful that is. So can you talk about the physical, the being a woman in a program of change? You know, what did it take? And what was the most difficult aspects of it?
Oh, yeah. One is like every time you had a menstrual period, it was like a huge nuisance because you had a meeting, didn't have access to a bathroom, and then you didn't have access to dispose of whatever you used. And I remember in one meeting, I used cotton. I mean, I've never written about it, but I can speak about it. I've lost shame entirely. The entire pad, when I got up, fell off. I got up and everybody saw it. And then, you know, I went out to the door and I must have died at 2,000 deaths, because then I thought, you know, this is my natural function and this happened. And if they saw it, good for them that they see it. You know, this is what happens on a daily basis to their wives, sisters, mothers. And all. I went back, picked it up and went out of the room again without feeling a sense of shame. It took a lot on my part to not feel ashamed. Yeah, to fight that sense of shame that we have.
And finally, we'll move away from the personal, but you at several episodes, you felt that you were really fighting depression, you know, Gita. Was there anybody around you who understood that? How did you overcome that depression? Mental health is like an explosion. It's a pandemic now. How did you get out of those bouts of depression that you suffered?
I didn't know that it was anything to do with depression, anything to do with anything at all. We had no clue what was mental illness. It was only after I had my daughter and I had a severe postpartum depression that I heard the word depression. And the whole dimension of the mind and the mind and body connection is even today not the thing. No, mental. It's not just an explosion; it's a hidden explosion. Nobody will admit. Everybody is in denial that you have some mental health issues, and women are the last people to take uh,
Yeah.
help. No, because it's a stigma, and you don't want to. The family doesn't give you importance. You give importance to everybody else because you're the caregiver. But when it comes to you, you're the last person to go for help. So it's a terrible thing now that women are facing.
So the two big aspects of your life and your book is your struggle to foreground and to change the structures of caste and class. So when you came to Ibrahimpatnam, for the audience who don't know that world at all, can you evoke like what is the structures of violence and entrenched violence that you saw, both in terms of caste and class?
Oh, it was a different world. When you walked into the village, you knew that whatever was there in the city didn't hold good here. In the city, there are normal, a citizen has normal rights, normal duties. You can't go around hitting people on the street. But here, if somebody is being hit, that's normal. If somebody is putting a rock on his farmhand's shoulder, that's normal. You can't intervene. And somebody beating up, wives were like beaten up like nobody's business. Everybody beat their wives. So I can't tell you that it was staggering the kind of violence that people would just put up with because I'd like to be like, out of my mind. I mean, how can this happen? This should be stopped right away. And people would look at me as if I'm some kind of crazy. There were different set of rules in the sense that those who owned land, those were the big landlords, could do what they wanted. Men could do what they wanted. Nobody should talk about it. And there was no rule of the law. You could pay your farmhands as low as 1 rupee a day if he was willing to take it. And police would never interfere on behalf of the. In fact, the poor would never dream of going to the police. Going to the police was a second punishment. So, which meant that a completely different set of laws operated there.
I was struck by the fact that you write that in this entire region, and it's probably true of so many pockets in India, certainly at that time, that the first question anyone asked you was, what are you, rather than who you are or your name. It's just like, what are you? They have to place you in your caste. And then you have a very powerful passage in the book where you say everything that you ate, what house you lived in, how quickly you could come out of a crisis, whether you could access the police, whether you could access health, what songs you sang, what food you ate, like every aspect of your life was defined by your caste.
Yeah, totally. And this was so normative. You couldn't question it. And the worst part of it is the people who are enforcing this, the landowners, they had relatives who were educated and liberals in the city. I mean, I named so many people who are like, standard bearers of civil rights and all that, who had fathers who've been rapists, who had brothers who've been, robbing the poor of their land. And it seems so, this two such disparate worlds that they can exist in one group. I mean, without questioning that we have so many people. So, because I worked in an area where the Reddys are the landlords. So any Reddy now in public life, and there must be so many watching this show, they must think back to see what did our fathers and grandfathers do. The capital with which I'm sitting here in front of a TV or doing the work I'm doing, that comes from the way they exploited the poor people there.
Before again, I want to ask about what you learned through this entire experience, Gita, and how it transformed you. I still want to familiarize the audience for those who don't even have an inkling about what it means to be a bonded labor. Tell us what those experiences, like what is it to be a bonded labor and not have land?
A bonded labor is that all your time is owned by the landlord, all your time. You may have to get up at 3 o'clock in the morning to switch on the motor or let the water into the fields. You may have to sleep all night there, surrounded by snakes and scorpions and everything. You don't get a day off, even if your daughter is getting married. You don't get a day off because once you've taken a debt, you are trained. So you can't join a strike with other laborers are joining. And very often, in my time at least, the newly married bonded laborer would always have to spend his night in the fields so that his bride would be taken to the Dora's house.
The Dora is the landlord, right?
Landlord, the big landlord of that area. There were families which, when you asked, how did you get bonded? They'd say, my grandfather took 8 annas, and then that debt grew to 1 rupee. So my father's debt grew to 500 rupees from that 1 rupee. And then my own debt is 5,000 rupees. So how does that 8 annas become 5,000 rupees? He says there's no way out of it. Once you're in it, you're stuck in it. So many of them were like generations of bondage. And because of this, the wages of the agricultural labor were depressed. When you have a sizable section that can work for almost free, and the other people, the other agricultural laborers also they're poor. At any given point of time, one single crisis can push them into this pool of free labor, right? So they are also very careful. Women used to work for 8 annas a day. 8 annas, I mean, even in 1985, 8 annas is like, ridiculous. For 8 annas, you'd get a plate of idlis, right? And they'd work for 8 annas a day. Pregnant women, old women, young women. And never could you question. If you questioned, you brought on violence of not just the landlord, but the state. And worst of all, they were totally like politically powerless.
So into this, setting which is completely divorced from any reality that you've known, you come as an urban, fairly heartbroken idealist into this setting, and it completely changed your way of working. So you created the Sangam, but this was now very people driven. It's the Madigas who are part of it, or other castes and communities eventually joined, but it was driven by the Madigas, and their entire program of transformation is very different. I was really mesmerized by many of the different strands of that. So can you, looking back, say, what did they teach you? You, of course, helped them get land, fight for their wages. A lot of change came, but how did they change you and your thinking?
Oh my, they gave me my life back. Actually, they gave me my life back because I didn't know. I had this idealism, this passion, everything was broken up. The ML was not an alternative, something else was not an alternative, NGO was not an alternative. So just staying with those people and following what they did in their daily life gave me back my life, because they are not pessimists at all. They are never pessimists. They are like any solution, they say, yes, we can break it, but give us a day or two. Nothing is like immediate. We'll sit and break our heads, and they would sit and break their heads and come out with a solution, a doable solution, which didn't have to, rupture communities, rupture families. And so you find that things are actually doable. And what we want is, in our daily lived lives, we want to see doable change. We don't want this grand, thing of some revolution at some distant point of time, something coming. We want in our daily life small bits of change that will demonstrate, yes, change is possible.
Yeah. I was contrasting this phase of your life with the beginning of the book, because here, yes, you really keep emphasizing this doability, that you understood the wisdom of doable change from them, and also the structure of their deliberations was so different from what you were describing, whether it's the Naxals or, nowadays even government, one has forgotten the importance in today's administration, the importance of consultation and consensus building. But you said they would sit for 2 days, 3 days on deliberations. It was so democratic. Everyone had a voice, and there would be discussion till everyone felt that they had been heard, and everyone rose amicably from that table, So that's like such a different, organic, and very powerful way of bringing change, much slower, much less glamorous.
Yes.
But, for you to submit to that was quite, like you say, it was a very transformative thing for you as well.
They gave me, if there's any wisdom in me, it's because of them.
And even at this stage of your life, you were still wanting some of the more flash and bang, throw the landlord's motor into the well, let's burn their hay, or let's burn their wheat field. And it's amazing that the people who are actually really suffering kept eschewing and not wanting to walk that path of violence.
So,
we won't have time to go into all your entire decade of experience there, but you eventually mobilized them. And it was a two-way process. You learned, but you also brought them the democratic tools of going to court, of filing petitions, of getting their land rights, working with government, pressurizing government. You helped do all of that through the Sangam. Looking back now, what do you think those years in the Sangam achieved for the people? And now we're like almost 20 years later or 30 years later. How have things changed? What lasting good did your life's work do over there?
Yeah. One is all the little children got out of cattle grazing, all went to school, and all of them now, all in their 30s and 40s, you meet a headmaster somewhere, you meet a teacher somewhere, you meet a real estate dealer somewhere, and they say, we were actually grazing cattle, you pulled us out of that, and you said, go to school and study. So that's like one, for me, it's like, it seems stupendous that these kids come up from nowhere and say, we were there and now we are here. There's far more awareness. There's an awareness of democratic tools and what people can use. What I see normally is that when people meet other people, they meet them through their community, or that is their caste or their family. So there's no sharing of lived experiences. Whereas in Ibrahimpatnam, even now, a Golla will meet a Madiga at the village shanty. They'll sit because they fought on some issue earlier. So they'll sit together and talk. Their children, because they attend each other's marriages and social functions. So the community is much larger in that way. So a larger community makes for richer political discussion and for exchange of ideas and for learning new things. So I think...
And the circumstances of bonded labor, or just the catchment of bonded labor, did you manage to diminish that?
In 15 years, it disappeared way back in, I'd say, 95 itself. Because there was ripples. People said, this is taking place here, this is taking place by word of mouth, relatives. And so people stopped putting up with it. People said, no, we won't work. But bonded labor went away, I'd say within about 10 years of I started work, all over, except for very remote areas, it just disappeared.
I could talk to you for 3-4 hours more, actually, Gita. You live such a rich life. There's so much to explore. But I'm just going to share this with the audience. We didn't go into that chapter that, after the emergency, when you were bereft and you had nowhere to go, your husband, Cyril, and you were working in Ghaziabad, again, amongst the absolute shanties there. And the people actually asked you to teach English. And you felt very, coming from the flaming radical Naxal politics, you felt it was almost something embarrassing and something reductive that you were doing to teach English to children of the shanties. But that too had a transformative experience. And you talk about going back, and those children escaped the accident of their birth as well, just by you helping them walk through that door of English, So a lot of humility that you had to learn about what can bring change.
Yes. So totally.
In many ways, Gita, though you started through radical violent politics and Naxal Bari movement, your life actually is a testament to the power of the Constitution, and if you make the Constitution come alive and you make people fight for the values of the Constitution and rally and sacrifice, we have it all. You have to just enliven that document, and your life really stands testimony to that. So now I'm going to come to that last bit, because it's again the reassertion of the woman, that you've lived this life. In many ways, it's satisfying. You can see real change. You're winning cases, you're winning petitions, you're seeing a psychographic change around you. And then you have this, almost like a rupture moment when you just want to give it all up. And you go back to living your life on your terms for yourself. Can you share that with the audience and explain the psychology of that?
Yeah, it was because the movement was coming to a dead end, in the sense that we were becoming powerful. We could unseat an MLA, we could seat an MLA. The police stations were open to us. In all the meetings of the local government that were being held, we were given pride of place. And anywhere, just the mention of the Sangam, and people would sort of say, okay, we won't do what we were planning to do. So it gets a little boring when there is, you become powerful. And then I found that, whatever work you do, you can lift people out of destitution into poverty. But from poverty, if you have to lift them out, There's so much bigger change that there needs to be employment potential. Lands were getting degraded, like nobody's business. And land degradation, tree cover being cut, livelihoods going. This is not an issue which a small movement can address. This is not even an issue which a state government can address. This is really a transnational issue because you need solutions on a far wider scale. And where do we start? I felt I had nobody with whom I can exchange opinions, get support from for these wider issues. Because they would say, form a political party. And that was the last thing I wanted to do. I mean, who wanted to get into politics after all that? So it was a dead end. And then everybody was calling me everywhere else saying, you duplicate this kind of change which you brought here. How can you do it all over again? Doing it that once is like, rediscovering yourself. Now, if you've discovered yourself, then you want another challenge to take up. And I wasn't ready for a challenge, or I don't know, the biological clock was ticking.
40.
And after 40, they say, that's this. And all those years of people saying, have a child, and resisting it, and fighting it. Somewhere, this one baby crossing the room, I can't tell you what an impact it made. When I came into the room, she was near the door. So she ran towards her mother. And I said, my God, nobody needs me like the child needs the mother. I'm loved, I'm respected, but that child went with this, absolutely driven to her mother. I wanted that kind of love. I don't know. It's that moment I said, I want a child. And then, so I had the baby. I had that. I lost the baby. I had a miscarriage. And so when you have a miscarriage, then you're even more determined. Yes, I want a baby. It gets strengthened somewhere if you lose something. So I had the baby. So it was like a very odd moment because nobody agreed with me. My husband was very upset. He said, you worked all these years and you built up something so nice. Why would you leave it? Take some time off, visit, travel elsewhere, and see what people are doing. Maybe you'll get some ideas as to what to do. And then he said, why baby? We've never had baby. We've always said no baby. And you say the woman is the one who gets stuck with a child. And now you want to, go back into that same dump. How can you do that? My friends are also unhappy. Villagers are like totally, shocked. But I don't know. I really can't explain why I did that. I don't regret it either. I mean, at that time, that was who I was. And I've always wanted to be true to myself. If I think something is right at that moment, I should do it. And my life is my life. I didn't work in Ibrahimpatnam for those poor people. I worked for myself. All what I did was for myself, my own learning, my enjoyment, my passion. So if this is what I want to do, I jolly well going to do it. So, I mean, I don't know, really can't explain all of it, but I'm trying to sort of say what drove me at that moment.
So I finally want your thoughts on marriage. In so many ways, that institution of marriage, the conventionality, the submission, the expectation that you will submit to that is what drove you into this great life of adventure, deprivation, exhilaration, learning, etc. But eventually you did marry Cyril. And
I've always thought the institution of marriage is outdated. Let me be very clear. I think because it's very difficult that partners keep in sync. So I would say, something like 10-year contract. After 10 years, you change, the other person doesn't change, then you change partners. I think one is the sacrosanct idea of marriage, like I'm like totally opposed to. I think that's like rubbish. My partner was also quite clear about it. When someone asked him, would you have married her if you met her 10 years later down the line, if you met him? He said, why would I marry her? Would I marry somebody else? I was quite shocked at that time, yeah? But it seems sensible that one is drawn to one person at a certain given point of time. At some other point of time, that changes. So marriage, what it does is sort of keeps two people in a jail together. And then you have all these things of working at a marriage, working at a relationship, all those things, pious platitudes which you throw down of it, but it's a bloody tough life, yeah. I mean, even those years, the movement kept my partner and I together because we were both like sort of so dedicated to it. But after this Ibrahimpatnam thing was there, and the child was born, and there are lots of issues. How do you raise a child? Because we want a child is a cultural imprint of oneself. So then we have all these clashes. Whose imprint? Whose child? How do you do it? Who does this? So that's my view on marriage broadly.
So that just brings us to the current moment. You live these very tumultuous years of when students, and there was a great amount of churn and dialogic change going on in our country, and you all were all part of that dialogue. So now when you come to where we are today, looking at where we are, what do you feel optimistic about? The nature of power that's changed or not, circumstances of working classes that have changed or not, and also what about today worries you deeply? If you were a student today, again going back into an ocean of change, what would you engage with? It's a big question. But
that's a big question. I'd start with where I am, because where I am is where I can take up the most work. So if I was, say, in touch with Muslims, I would think working with Muslims and forming some kind of a defense union with them would be like paramount, I think, because they are suffering so much today, and there is need of an organization, not just of support, but even of empowering them in the sense they have to be able to say what they want to say. So I think work with Muslims is like very important. And the nature of what is coming over India today, in the sense we're becoming such a majoritarian state, and all levels of the authority, constitutional authorities like the courts or the administration, are bending to this. So how do we extricate ourselves from this? I mean, I'm optimistic in the sense that we're not going to be like this. There's to be bound to be a change, and we'll come. There's bound to be a low, and from the low we'll climb up. I'm optimistic of that. You can't keep people down forever, but how do you organize the most number of people so that you minimize damage and violence? Otherwise, there's bound to be a lot of damage caused, no? So how do you organize the most people so that you minimize damage and violence? So which really means, I think, back to grassroots work. I don't think there's an alternative to grassroots work. We can't have coalitions of people sitting in Delhi or Hyderabad talking. We need to have people working in villages and bastis, organizing people, because if the poorest people who are the least communal, they can't afford to be communal, right? It's the middle classes who are sitting on their aspirational goals who can afford to be communal. So we need to go back to grassroots work, and we need to be generous to each other. And the groups are like so much at each other's throats. The Dalits won't speak to the left won't speak to somebody else, the feminists are contemptuous of everybody. How do we do that if we don't sort of be generous to each other and work together? So I think that's the two things are grassroots and working together.
Yeah, I have so many more questions to put to you, Gita. As I said, I could talk to you for a couple more hours, also dissecting and analyzing where we are at today as a nation, the state of our democracy, structures of power, how the working classes conditions have improved or not improved. There's so much to talk about, but I'm going to leave it there to end on this optimistic note. It's interesting you said this. I've just done an interview with a political scientist from Yale, talking about why American democracy is in crisis, and he said the similar thing. He said that strangely progressive ideas now don't have vehicles of intensity. There are no movements that are pushing for progressive values, grassroots, committed, willing to do the hard work. Whereas there are other ideologies that have more dedicated people working on their movements. And so that's the strange juncture that a lot of democracies find themselves in today. I think for me, reading your book, what was the most wonderful thing I took away from it is something that matters to me deeply, is that, this early part of your life, you started off trying to change the location of power. And by the end of your work, and you're still working, but in the end of this active people's work, you were really engaged in trying to change the nature of power rather than the location of power. And I think that's an amazing message to take from someone's life. So thank you very much for talking to me, Gita.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Yeah.